Just as a reminder, as for the previous sessions, we have two presenters, each is presenting for 20 minutes. Then we have a discussant who will talk for 10 minutes, and then a general discussion after each one of the papers have been presented and discussed. During the Q&A, please raise your virtual hand using the WebEx feature, and when called, unmute and start your video, and be clear and direct because we have limited time and we want to give everyone a chance to participate. So with that, we can start with our first presenter, Marlene Coffey, who's presenting the paper Innovative Ideas and Gender Inequality. The floor is yours, Marlene.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Thank you very much to all of you for attending this presentation. I'm really free to present my papers on innovative idea and gender inequality, and let me start with the motivation. Next slide, please. So there is a huge literature talking about some gender-related issue in education and labor. For example, the difference in terms of wage gap, the difference in terms of school attendance, the underrepresentation of women in math-intensive field. There are some potential explanations that have been provided in the literature, such as family commitment, risk aversion, competitiveness, and also sometimes some discriminatory factors. But so far, less is known on the recognition of women's idea. And at the same time, academic research offers kind of an idea framework or a suitable framework to analyze idea, and in particular to see how women ideas are perceived, used, and referred to. And there is also a growing literature showing some type of gap or discrimination or bias in gender bias in economic literature. And that tend also to be more prevalent in economics compared to other social science or even other STEM fields. Next slide, please. So the question that I'm asking in this paper are the following. Is the credit given to women's work, and or are women facing any bias in the recognition of their work? And by work, I mean academic work. And if so, what are the effects and or the implication of such a bias? Next slide, please. So in this paper, I studied the recognition of women's work in male-dominated fields such as economics. I will use citation or omission from reference, and I have this a picture to show you like what I will be doing in this paper. So let's say that you want to write a paper, and in writing this paper, there is a bunch of other papers in the related literature. And for example, you have 500 papers that are kind of closely related to yours. So in writing your paper, you have to make a choice and who you want to cite. You have to select the paper that you want to cite. And in making this choice, it's possible that we can have some type of bias, and why not a gender bias? By contrast, imagine that you have an automated algorithm where each time you want to write a paper, you just uh, insert the keyword or the abstract if you have it, and it provides you like the paper that are closely related to yours. And by construction of such an automated algorithm, this is pretty much agnostic of the gender. So by construction, there is no inherent gender bias. And the question that I'm asking is the following: what happens if we contrast the author choice and the automated algorithm choice? Next slide, please. So the contribution of this paper will be twofold. The first part will be on the topic. So I shed new light on the lack of recognition of women's work. I present some heterogeneous pattern depending on the gender of the citing, the journal, the institution, also the field. I show some potential effect on future outcome and career path. The second part is more methodological, where I use deep learning, especially natural language processing for public policy. I build a distance to link different papers. So I will have a citing paper, a cited paper, and a paper that should be cited according to the distance metric. I construct the omission index. This gives you the state where a paper that is closely related to another paper is not cited by the former. And the last part will be based on the patent literature. I will construct an innovativeness index that is kind of an alternative way to measure the quality of the paper. Next slide, please. So in terms of the finding, the key finding is what I call here the 2020 pattern. On average, omitted paper tend to have an order of omission. The order of omission of paper written by female tend to be 20% higher compared to the order of omission of paper written by male. And I exhibit also some difference, like for example, having male in the citing paper increase this omission probability by up to 6 percentage points compared to having female in the compared to females cited or omitted. Sorry. And the second part is also that even females that are published in the top 5 journal are not exempted from this omission. And as I said, I construct the innovativeness index to have an alternative way to measure the quality of the paper. And if I compare this to what the existing way to measure the quality, that is kind of the citation, I can see that to have the same level of citation as paper written by me, paper written by female need to be 20% upper in terms of the quality, the innovativeness distribution. And the last part of the paper provides some insight. This is more suggestive evidence that past omission could have some effect on the future career path of the author. And for example, I put here the example of the publication in top 5 journal, and I see a link, a correlation between past omission and future publication, where past omission reduce the probability to get published in a top 5 journal, for example, by up to 5 percentage points. Next slide, please. So there are a couple of papers that are part of the literature talking about either gender in economics, gender in academia, and other literature using text analysis. So the paper that tend to be the closest, closely related to mine is a paper by Sarson, where she also look at the recognition of women's work, but in her work she look at like how co-authoring with the opposite gender affect the probability of getting the tenure. In my case, I explicitly use the reference to study the recognition of women. So that's the point I can make for this. Next slide, please. So this presentation, we have three main parts. The first part will be the data description. The second part, how you move from textual analysis to the construction of the omission and innovative index. The last part will be the empirical strategy with some type of discussion at the end if we have some time. Next slide, please. Next slide. So for the data description, I use data from Web of Science, Econet, and also RePEc. So I focus in the main part of the paper on paper journal that have been in all major top 20 ranking. And the reason why I'm focusing on those journals is because those are a signal of quality. So I want to minimize that one reason for which one group or another group is not cited is because of the quality of the paper. And in the baseline, I will have like 24,000 paper ranging from 1991 to 2019. And this will exclude paper without abstract and reference, and proceeding papers, comment, book review, biographical item. So I really want to focus on full-length paper to assess the citability, if you want, or not. And on top of that, I want to precise that I focus on published paper again, because this is a signal of quality. This is the first reason. And the second reason is that if in the reviewing process at some point, and because of the high standard that are imposed in the reviewing process, I'm hoping that if there is something that is missing, maybe this paper will be added in the reference. So I focus on published paper. Next slide, please. So this is a snapshot on the type of data that I extracted from Web of Science. So as you can see here, there is the title. I can have the author, the journal, some detailed information about the journal, such as the volume, the issue, and also the DOI, the published year, and the abstract. So I use the abstract, the keyword, especially for the text analysis part. I have also information about the institution, the citation count, and the reference. Next slide, please. So the second stage of the paper is to find the gender of the author, and after that infer the gender composition of those authors in a given paper. So to find the gender of the author, I use gender recognition based on first name. So I use an automated algorithm that is called GenderWise. On top of that, I complete this with mostly a manual check. So if the probability that the gender is we have a certain gender is lower than 0.8, I proceed to a manual check to see like if the author is a female, is a man or a woman. So basically, I go on website, I check if I have a picture, I have an article talking about this author using some pronouns and so on to match the gender of the author. And from that, I can infer the gender of the paper in quotes. So for example, if we have only men in a given paper, this will be a male author paper. If we have only women in a given paper, this will be a female author paper. And if we have at least one male, at least one female, we can have a different subdivision, like at least one female paper, a mixed gender paper, or majority of female paper. In the database overall, in terms of the descriptive, 5% of the paper are written by only women. So those are female author paper. 74% by only men. So those are male author paper. But I have 77% of the author that are men and 70% of the author that are women. And as you can see, the percentage doesn't add up to 100, and especially the 70 and the 70 percent and the 17%, because there are some authors for which I can't find any gender. Next slide, please. So after that, I construct the similarity index based on the textual information. So how I do it? So the textual similarity, basically the idea is to see the commonality in the topical content of each paper. And after that, let's say that we have two papers, as you can see in this plot. We have one talking about orange, the other one talking about apple. The idea is to have a vector representation of those two papers based on the word inside the paper. And after, see the angle between those two papers. And this angle will give us the distance between two different papers that we are trying to compare. So after that, I construct the omission index having those similarity. And to make this more concrete, I have an example in the next slide. So let's say that we take three papers as it is here, P prime and P second. We have like the first stage is, let's say we have the abstract, you take the abstract, and after that you split the abstract in a set of words, as you can see on the first column of this table. And to have those words, we have some data cleaning process where we drop words that are meaningless, we drop some stuff that are not useful, like the punctuation, for example. In my case, I also drop the number. I also take care of the acronym that are very frequent in economics. And finally, I have this list of words. And for each paper, I can say the number of times this word have been used in the given paper. Next slide, please. And after that, I compute this metric that's called the term frequency inverse document frequency. So the term frequency is the number of times a given word appears in the paper divided by the total length of the paper. The inverse document frequency is the number of paper, total number of paper in the database divided by the total number of paper in which we have a certain word. So for example, if I take the word trade credit here, the first cell is saying that the word trade credit appears 6 times in paper P, and I divide it by the total length of paper P times the IDF of the word trade credit in the whole database, because the IDF is dependent on all the documents that we have in the database. And finally, to compute the distance matrix, so the similarity, this is the dot product that is normalized. So for example, I will have the TF-IDF of the word trade credit in paper P times the TF-IDF of the word trade credit in paper P prime plus the TF-IDF of the word retailer in paper P times TF-IDF retailer in paper P prime, and so on. And I divide by the norm 2. So after this stage, next slide, please. I have like all the pairwise similarity. So for each paper, I have the similarity with all the other paper in the database, and I can rank those similarity to have like the relative importance of each paper in terms of the distance metric. And from this ranking, I can exhibit the most similar paper. So in the baseline, I choose the most similar set to have like 5 paper, but I increase like this number. I play around this number basically in the robustness of the paper. And if I take the construction of the omission index will be as follow. It will take 1 if the paper P does not cite paper P prime, conditional on the paper being in the most similar set, and we take 0 otherwise. And to come back to the example that we have so far, so when we look at the relative frequency, pretty much those papers tend to talk about the same thing and are pretty close. And what happened in the database is the following. I've cited P seconds. So the omission index between P and P second will be equal to 0 because P cited P second, given that P second is in more similar set. But P does not cite P prime, even P prime being in the non-similar set. So the omission index will be equal to 1. And it appears that P prime is a female author paper and P second is a male author paper. So this is basically the type of pattern that I'm capturing in the data. Next slide, please. So lastly, for this text analysis part is the construction of the innovativeness index. So as I said, this is based on the pattern literature, especially paper by Kelly and others. So the idea here is to construct a metric that take into account similarity for a given paper with all the past literature, but also similarity for a given paper with all the future literature. So if I take a paper that is published in a given year, I look at all the paper published before. This is a backward similarity. And also for the same paper, I look at all the paper published after. This is the forward similarity, and I add up all of those similarities. And the idea is the following. If a paper is novel, we expect the backward similarity to be lower because this paper introduced some new content or some new notion that do not exist in the past. If the paper have influenced the future literature, we expect the forward similarity to be higher because based on this paper, the other literature build on this. So we have the numerator basically of the innovativeness index that will be higher, and for the backward similarity that is lower, the denominator will be lower. So a paper with a high level of innovativeness index will tend to have a high forward and a low backward. So this is the idea. Next slide, please. Next slide. So for the empirical strategy, so the idea here will be to use the omission index, that's basically a binary variable, that have been constructed to see how this is influenced by the gender. So the main dependent variable will be the gender. So the coefficient of interest is beta 0 here, and I control for a wide range of other variables, ranging from variables that are specific to each paper, for example, the institution, the field, the gender structure of the most similar, the number of authors, the number of reference, variables that are common to the different paper. So, for example, if they share the same primary field, if they have the same gender structure of the author, the same affiliation, and so on. And also variable in terms of the timing. So the difference in publication year and some year fixed effect also. So I just want to precise that I here is the citing paper, so the paper that's cited at a given point in time, and J is the cited or omitted paper, so the paper that appear in the most similar set and that should be cited basically, according to the distance metric. Next slide, please. So the main result of the paper is given in these tables, and as you can see, controlling for a wide range of variables, we still have like the order formation of paper written by women tend to be 20% higher on average compared to the order formation of paper written by female. And this finding is strong and robust to some alternative robustness that I put here. On the next slide, I present like some heterogeneous effects that depend on the journal and on the institution. I have others on the field, and I think the field aspect could be also of interest for macroeconomists at the central bank. But let me talk about this general aspect on depending on the journal and the institution. So as you can see here, even paper published in top journal are not exempted from the omission. So having male in the citing paper increase omission of female by up to 4%, 5%, 5.3 percentage points if we look at top 5 journals, column 2. And one thing that is very interesting is also for the institution effect. So we can see here that like there is kind of a concentration of the effect on the mid-tier institution. So the low tier and the top tier tend to have some degree of omission, especially two-sided gender omission, but the bulk of the effect is really concentrated on the mid-tier, and this is very interesting to think about the mechanism. So as I say, I won't present this here, but again, if I take by field, there is a difference depending on the field, where more theoretical fields tend to exhibit higher omission compared to more empirical fields. Next slide, please.
Marlene, you have 2 or 3 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. So here I have a couple of robustness that are presented here, and I will be happy to discuss them if during the Q&A session. Next slide, please. So one of the big questions is this gap due to discrimination or other factor? And one thing that is important to mention here is that we have some potential trait identification, especially omitted variable bias. So for example, imagine we can think about networking, I don't know, self-advertisement, maybe women are not self-advertising their paper and so on. So those are things that it will be difficult to control for that. So I propose two tests here to get around those limitations. The first one is to test if this is a lack of information. So lack of information, I consider the case where there is an increasing likelihood that the different author can know each other. So for example, if we share the same institution, if we are in the same network of co-authors and so on. The second one is to see like if there is a difference depending on the perception that we have on one's gender based on the first name. So there is a mistake here. This is not surname, it's first name. So for concretely, what I'm testing is the following: is Hannah omission probability greater than Cameron omission probability? And the idea used doing this is that if there are some heterogeneous effects unobservable that affect differently the gender, when we condition on a given gender, we should not expect any difference. So this is the hypothesis behind. Next slide, please. And what I'm finding is very interesting because actually Cameron has a lower probability to get omitted compared to Anna. And if I control this using like similarly for male, so if I take Cameron, which is a male, compared to Robert, which is a name that we know to be a male name, I observe also that Cameron has a relatively higher omission compared to Robert. So this is very interesting and give some intuition towards what is happening in the data. Next slide, please. So the next step, as I told you, I consider an alternative way to measure the quality of the paper using the innovativeness index. And with this plot, you can see that those are the citation and the innovativeness index are pretty much in line, except that we observe a gap between men and women if we take the citation compared to the innovativeness index. So to have the same level of citation, women need to be 20% upper in terms of the innovativeness distribution. Next slide, please. And if we compensate this by the number of omitted citations, we can see that this gap vanishes away. Next slide, please. So let me end with this part. That is just some scientific evidence that what can happen depending on the past omission. And basically what I observe is taking different type of outcome publication in top 5 citation and what I call one shot. It's just the fact of appearing just one time in the database, like you disappear after, basically. I observed that there is a negative effect regarding those outcomes. So the omission, past omission tend to affect future outcome. At least there is some suggestive evidence that there is a correlation with future outcome of the author. Next slide. So I will just conclude here by saying that I present some new evidence of gender bias in omission from reference. Paper written by women 20 percentile likely to are more omitted compared to paper written by men. Even paper published in top 5 are not exempted from that, and this tend to be not explained by seniority or lack of information. And from a policy side, I think this paper really raised awareness of the author, of the editor and the referee, and also of the institution, because citation matter to have grant, to have tenure, and all those things. It's important to be aware of such issue. Thank you very much for the question.
Laura, please go ahead with your discussion.
Okay, so first of all, thanks a lot for having me. Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to read the paper. So I saw Marlene presenting this paper in a seminar longer than this one, but so also have the opportunity to read it. It was great. So I'm going to first start summarizing this, but just because for me it was difficult to settle ideas. But I mean, Marlene did a fantastic job in her presentation. So I will try to be brief on that and then move to the comments. So next slide, please. Next slide. So what the paper does, well, the paper investigates whether there are gender biases in citation patterns, and specifically whether articles by equally relevant and innovative male and female authors are similarly placed. Okay. So the great thing about this paper is that Marlene is able to use machine learning techniques and also bibliometric data and articles published in very good journals. So this is really good papers. but use this information to establish whether first there are similarities between papers and do this in a very automatic way for an incredibly large number of papers. And also then it's also possible to build links between papers and to identify first, okay, the papers that cite in a given paper, that this is difficult to do, but I think that more or less we understand how to do this. Also those that are cited, but I think that what is even more interesting, and for me, it's like the big contribution of this paper is also those that should be cited and they are not. So this measure of the omission by index, that is so crucial for the analysis here, okay? So next slide, please. And in terms of what the paper finds, so there is this, well, if on average, these omitted papers are 20% less likely to be cited if they are coming from female authors than male authors. But also there are very nice heterogeneity in terms of the effect. So one of the results that was also for me very interesting to see is that the papers that are most likely to be omitted are those that are coming from women that are working at a nuclear institution and also publishing in top journals. So I think that this visibility is going to be one of the very important issues here to understand what is going on, okay? So then there are also other heterogeneity patterns that probably were more familiar to or that somehow we were like expecting to have, because they are also prevalent in other papers that have been looking at these different treatments for females in the academia. So that this omission bias is higher in theoretical fields than in applied fields. Also, the more the article is perceived to be female, and also when there are indeed, I mean, when who is the one that should be citing or not. Also, the gender of those matters a lot. Okay. So then, although this is only suggestive evidence, but I think that it's very important that also the paper gets complemented with this additional piece of information on why we should care about this. It's also because, indeed, being omitted has an impact in your career, okay? So one possible quantification of this is that, it's reducing the probability of getting published in the top 5 journal in the future. And as you can imagine, this impact is more small, okay? So next slide. So my comments first, well, I see this paper as a high quality work that is making use more than that the range of data that is available there is how he managed to process this information, okay? So I think that really this construction of the omission index is a very important methodological contribution. But it's still, I mean, I think that also calls for more examination of what would be done with this data. Okay, so next slide for specific comments on that. So for me, what is still the puzzle in all of this literature is how to break this cycle. Okay, so we have these gender biases, and I still don't see how to break that. Okay, because I mean, this is one piece in terms of citation, but we have seen in general that there are like lower levels of visibility, opportunities to be visible apparently for women in the academia relative to men. Okay, so with Carlos, we were seeing this in the sense of getting accepted to conferences. As you can imagine, this is like something that we have to do several times within a year. So even with taking into account as much as possible covariates, still there is this significant gender bias. Okay, so this will be one step also. So if people don't see you presenting, they are not going to cite you, because I mean, what is great about this paper is that, okay, let's confront what people do, what the machine will be doing. Okay, but we are not machines, so sometimes when we have papers and we have to include sites, reference that are for us, this reference has been at some point visible for us. So we get to find that reference somehow. It can be coming from our co-authors, from our networks, from people that are presenting at our departments, or to be in conferences. But if people are not, if women are not participating there that much, I'm sure that is also affecting how we cite there. And also, this could be conferences. It's also we have, I mean, there's also evidence that we have a smaller networks. Also, when we are presenting somehow, we also have a smaller audience. So even online, we have a smaller reach, okay? So for me, it's a matter of how to break all these different channels that is like putting us in, I don't know, less visible position in the career and the profession. So so most likely that people are not aware of what we are doing, okay? And then this is a very, another comment that is also associated with the same idea is that something that I don't know, I couldn't find in the paper is for this calculation of how this, I mean, the implication of this omission in our careers afterwards is whether indeed, I mean, it could even bigger that impact if we take into account that, I mean, in the future we are having less women because some of them already left the academia. So, and we know that this is something that could happen. Okay, so I don't know up to, I mean, whether really for that analysis you are like only considering those that are still there, those that remain. But just to mention that the impact could be even bigger, or even it was just nice to see in as an additional outcome, how, if it's possible, I don't know whether it's possible to look at whether this omission could also affect your livelihood of living indeed. That it would be like a very, even like a very severe outcome for this, okay? So thanks a lot for this work. And thanks a lot for increasing the awareness for people. I think that in many cases they are even not aware of what they are doing. So this is why I think that this kind of references are so important and useful in the profession. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Laura, for your discussion. So before I go to the questions, Marlene, do you want to give a brief answer to Laura's discussion?
Yeah, thank you very much, Laura, for this great discussion. I mean, you emphasize some key points of the paper and also some key point that should be addressed at least in the further research of this topic. And one thing, two couple of things that I just want to say is regarding the idea of survivorship bias. So yeah, really, I try to to assess this with this variable that I just call wild shot to some extent, just to characterize the fact that we have you like just one time in the database, and I think I count the sample like your last publication and your only publication was before 2010, so that the years after are not just to include like the time length to get published in those journals and so on. I mean, increasing the chance to capture this exit pattern, but it's true that this could be a really cool pattern a really cool outcome to look into at some point. Yeah, and I agree. Like I mean, as I said, next research really, I think this will be the topic: how to break this vicious cycle, how to bring women on the top, and so yeah. So yeah, thank you very much for those comments.
So I see that Sarah has a question. Before going to Sarah, let me ask you a question. So you've provided some very interesting data, some very interesting analysis, and as we've seen already today during the other presentations, during the panel, the conference, and so on, I mean, people have admitted that realizing that there is a problem, realizing that there is a bias is already like taking us halfway, to the solution or through the solution. But so, I could not help myself, during the presentation to think about, okay, so what can we do to address this? And I think that in your particular case, there could be some kind of solutions in that, the same way that, for example, a journal can, is asking for people to submit data, to submit, their programs. They could also ask, here is a tool created by Marlene Coffey, to check whether you're in fact, including all the references of people that are included in your work. or it could be done at the very beginning. So I don't know, for example, there are services where you can go and, when you're interested in a topic, you can sort of search, the papers that are related to that topic. And so these are just like a couple of things that come to my mind. But so I just wanted to pose the question to you as well. So when you were writing this paper, I'm sure that, you thought about, okay, what can I do with it? What is it that the profession can do in order to, if not solve this problem, at least ameliorate this problem?
So yeah, thank you very much, Yana, for those points. So exactly that's what I was saying by raising awareness. Basically, the idea is that you know what is happening, you know how to end, especially like the part where I use the compensation of the omission to complete the citation, and you can see that the gap vanishes when we use the innovative and compared to the citation. Like we know that first we have to realize that there is a problem on this from this side. And the next step is we know basically that if we can correct in a certain way by computing such a matrix, like computing the number of omission that one can have, or computing any other metric that people we want to come up with to compensate at least this gap that we observe. So this is really the direction that I have in mind when I say awareness of all of those, the authors, the editors, and other people. And if I take the editor and the referee and so on, like you, now, I guess now, to some extent, you have to pay attention really to what is going on, to what is happening in terms of the reference of what who the author is cited, basically. This is one thing also. And after talking about the compensation, especially for the tenure, I was just looking at the paper by Sasson actually, and see like what is the influence of one citation on the probability to get tenure, because she controls on that. And actually it's like 5% increase in the probability to get tenure. So if we can compensate using those type of index for the women, I think that will be something really great. So yeah, I definitely agree, and that's what I point out with the awareness thing.
Sarah, please go ahead with your question.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I don't know if you covered this, and apologies if you did, but I was wondering how to think about co-authorship. So, I mean, if I'm a man, does that mean if I co-author with a woman, my citations are reduced, or are you just focusing on papers that are sort of solely authored by women? I wasn't sure whether it was the share of women and whether it sort of mattered whether it was sort of two women writing together, or one woman writing with a man, or one woman versus one man, and how should we think about co-authorship?
So basically, thank you, Sarah, for emphasizing this point. I haven't time to cover all of those during the presentation. So basically, the mixed gender team are kind of between the women and the men, basically, in terms of the omission. So if I have to rank them, like the omission probability of men is lower compared to the omission probability of mixed gender team, that is lower compared to the omission probability of all female team, basically, all female author. So there are really in between those two.
Thank you. I think that we have no more questions, so we can move on to the next presentation. And it's actually Sarah who's going to present the next paper on gender differences in economic opinions. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present this work at this conference. It's been a really fascinating event so far, with lots of interesting discussions and ideas. This paper is fairly preliminary, so it's very nice to have the opportunity to present it. It's joint work with Hans Sivertsen, who's also at the University of Bristol. Can I have the next slide, please? So we're very aware that groups of senior economists are largely numerically dominated by men. So some statistics here on the share of professors, chief economists in banking and finance, and also economic advisory council members. There are lots of, there's lots of discussion about the consequences of the lack of diversity in economics. So it restricts the talent pool, It may narrow perspectives and leads to groupthink. It shapes the discipline because men and women differ in the sort of particular things they're interested in, and also in the substantive opinions that they hold. So women tend to be more favourable towards government intervention, for example. The specific contribution of this paper is looking at gender differences in how men and women express their opinions. So not the substantive opinions that they hold, but in how those opinions are expressed. So the conclusion is that economics is dominated by opinionated men. So not only is economics dominated by men, but male economists tend to be more opinionated than female economists. So the paper really establishes a sort of fairly simple stylized fact and then discusses some of the implications. Next slide, please. So we're not the first to look at gender differences in expressing opinions. There have been experimental studies which have looked at sort of general population samples or student samples and found that women are less likely to express their opinion than men. So what we're doing is looking at whether this difference is present in a real world relevant sample. I think it's important because obviously what may be true of the population may not hold among a group of very self-selected people. Economists and the type of economists we're looking at who are really economists who are at the very top of their field are not like the general population. And so looking at whether gender differences are present among this group of very selected people, I think is important for thinking about whether differences in opinions might be relevant for sort of real world decision making. So I think what's really striking about what we find is that there are clear gender differences among a group of academic and real world economic experts who have also explicitly agreed to be on a panel in which they're going to be asked their opinions, and yet we still find these gender differences among a group of people, between men and women. So we're not really able to say anything about why these gender differences are present. In the literature, a number of factors have been highlighted. So there's, for example, gender differences in self-confidence, which may either be a different estimation by men and women of their ability or knowledge, or different levels of precision about beliefs. So I might not want to express my opinion because I might have a high level of uncertainty about the state of the world. There may also be gender differences in social confidence. So these are opinions which are expressed publicly, and men and women may differ in their confidence in expressing opinions publicly, and or they may anticipate different reactions in terms of expressing their opinions publicly. So we're not going to say anything about why the gender differences are present. We're simply looking to see whether there are gender differences and then thinking about what that means. Next slide, please. So I will talk about the data which come from the IGM Expert Economist Panel and present the results. And then we've got some even more preliminary results from the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, because we're interested in seeing whether these gender differences of opinions are relevant for real world economic decision making. And then I think, again, some reflection on implications at the end. Next slide, please. So the main data that we look at comes from the IGM Expert Economist Panel. That's so it's run from the University of Chicago Booth School of Management. So it was established in 2011 with the aim of exploring the views of initially US-based economists on a wide range of different topics. There were initially around 50 US economists, and then a European panel was set up several years later. So not that you're expected to take in all the names, but I've listed who is in our sample in detail on the right, with the women highlighted in blue. So approximately 21% of the sample is women. So that's sort of in line with, I guess, what we'd expect, maybe slightly higher than the share of women who are professors in the US and the UK. They're a very homogeneous group. So roughly 70% have a PhD from the same 5 institutions. And you can see around half of them are currently based at around 5 institutions. So again, what is surprising is that we have gender differences among a group of people who are really quite homogeneous, both in their training and also in their sort of current institution. And there aren't gender differences so the women are just as likely to be from this narrow group of institutions as the men are. So the sample, the panel are asked approximately 2 questions each month on a whole range of different issues. So ranging from, beliefs about the impacts of COVID, beliefs about Brexit, beliefs about the minimum wage, sort of beliefs about the way markets work, a hugely diverse set of topics. The nice thing about the data is it's quite a large sample with sort of 100 experts and multiple questions. We have about 18,000 responses. I guess there's a question about to what extent are these opinions meaningful for real-world decision-making? They are just opinions. Some of the members here hold policy positions. The responses are published as shared with the public and receive some media attention. They're not influencing real-world decision-making directly. So hence one of the reasons we're sort of interested in the Bank of England sort of as a separate panel to see whether these gender differences in opinion are kind of reflected in real-world decision-making as well as just sort of opinion giving. Next slide, please. So this is the way the questions are asked and the data are presented. So this is a question about vaccinations. So would mandatory vaccinations and a regular testing, would that promote a faster and stronger economic recovery? So the experts are asked to say whether they agree or disagree with the statement. There's a 5-point Likert scale. Do they strongly agree, uncertain, disagree, or strongly disagree? They don't respond to every question, and that's actually one of the dimensions we're going to look at. And then the experts are also asked to say how confident they are in their opinion. So they can say how confident they are on a scale from 1 to 10. The IGM weights the responses by the expert's confidence when it publishes the results. The experts can also leave a comment, and we'll also look at the extent to which men and women comment. So these are the data. And if you show the next slide, we use these sort of survey responses to construct different measures of, how people express their opinions. So we kind of grouped them into different categories. So we've got 2 measures which we call sort of volubility, which is how much men and women express opinions. So we take kind of whether someone actually responds to the survey as a measure of whether someone gives an opinion. So you can see, just over 80% of experts respond. There's sort of no opinion is on average around 17.5%. We also take a second measure of volubility, which is whether the respondent leaves a comment. Then we have a extent to which experts are sort of express strong opinions, express opinions with certainty, and express opinions with confidence. So we have a measure of whether the respondent is uncertain, whether the respondent strongly agrees or disagrees, and also how confident the respondent is. And then we also look at the extent to which respondents go against the consensus. So there's an earlier study that looked at sort of consensus in economics, and so we thought this was also interesting. Right, so these are the outcome measures that we're going to look at and see whether there are differences between men and women in their volubility, in their certainty, and their confidence. Next slide, please. We also look at whether this varies by whether the question falls within the economist field or not. So we classified all the questions according to a set of fields, and we also classified the academics or the economists according to their field based on their NBR, CPR affiliations. So in the psychology literature, there's a phenomenon called male answer syndrome, which is basically that men have opinions about things they know nothing about. So we're interested to see whether, is it the case that men just sound off about things where they're not expert, and actually when it comes to giving opinions in your own field, men and women behave the same. If that were the case, then in a sense, these differences would be less important for real world policy making, because of, typically economists are asked to give opinions on things that fall within their field. So, if we see these gender differences when questions are in field, then this is sort of more significant for real world policy making than if it's just men sort of engaging in this male answer syndrome. So you can see just over 1/3 of questions are in a field. There's actually no significant difference in the average number of fields. So it's not the case that men are sort of expert in more fields than women are. There are gender differences in how female different fields are, as you'd expect. So labour is the most female field, macro tends to be the least female field. And we'll come back to sort of what some of the implication for the gender difference in opinions might be across fields later. Next slide, please. We also, possibly more controversially, sort of try and categorise the questions. So, so some of the questions we think of as being positive questions, by which we mean they're sort of empirically verifiable, and there's relevant evidence. So, for example, a question about the impact of the minimum wage is a question where there is a body of evidence that someone might draw on in giving an answer. Several of the questions are normative. So, you know, they're asking not only about the economic effects, but whether a policy option is a good idea, which in a sense has a sort of implicit value judgment and a trade-off. So, you know, we wondered whether it was the case that, you know, men were more willing to make the trade-offs and women weren't. And then finally, some of the questions are about core elements of theory. So there's a statement about whether investors can sort of outperform the market, which is sort of seems to be a question about a very core theory element within economics. So these categorizations are meaningful to the extent that there's sort of the lowest level of certainty in normative questions and the highest level of certainty in theory questions. And we also look at whether the gender differences hold within these different question types. Again, you know, I guess we're thinking of economists being asked possibly more positive questions rather than normative questions, probably not giving expert opinions on elements of theory. So I think it's, again, useful to sort of think about whether the gender differences we observe are meaningful for real world opinion giving and decision making. Next slide, please. So these are really our main results. So we have these 6 dimensions of opinions and significant gender differences across all of these different dimensions. So women are significantly less likely to give an opinion. In other words, they're significantly less likely to respond to the question. You know, they're on the panel, they know they're going to get asked questions, but they're significantly less likely to respond. They're significantly more likely to say they're uncertain. They're significantly less likely to vote against the consensus. They're significantly less likely to give a strong opinion, to say that they strongly agree or disagree. They're significantly less likely to leave a comment. And they have significantly lower level of confidence in terms of their confidence in their answer. Next slide, please. One of the other things we explored is whether there's variation over time. So, you know, I guess thinking about this idea of social confidence, we wondered whether, you know, maybe women were more hesitant to start with, but gained confidence over time, or perhaps men were overconfident to start with and lost confidence over time. Actually, what you see is that these differences are remarkably sort of persistent, or at least there's no significant trends. So again, I think this means that these gender differences are meaningful for policy making to the extent that people don't tend to learn and update. This is a behavior which is relatively persistent over time. Next slide, please. And in terms of whether the differences are just on questions where people are non-expert or areas where people are expert, we find that there are significant gender differences both when women are asked questions, both when men and women are asked questions in fields in which they're expert and also in fields in which they're not expert. So there's probably too many bars in the figure, but basically we've got the gender differences, men in green, women in grey, the non-expert on the left and the expert on the right. So you could see, for example, that there's a sort of gender gap in confidence when women are expert and non-expert. There's a gender gap in giving an opinion when women are expert and when people are expert and non-expert. So as you'd expect, expertise does increase certainty, volubility and confidence, but women are still less certain, less voluble and less confident than men, even when they're answering questions that are in their field. And then looking at these different types of questions, we find that these gender differences are present both on positive and normative questions. They're slightly weaker when it comes to theory. But on positive and normative questions, which we see as the type of questions that economists might be asked for their opinions, we find these gender differences are present. So roughly women experts behave more like men who are non-experts in terms of their certainty, volubility and confidence. Next slide, please. So, I guess, women are less confident than men is not perhaps on the face of it so surprising, but I think what is striking is this is a group of people who have made it to the very top in the profession. Economists are not, we've heard about the hostile environment. These are people who are very successful in their fields. They're a self-selected group. They've agreed to be on a panel where they know they're going to be asked their opinions. So I think that, a key takeaway that, I think we really need to, even if we implicitly know that women are less confident, I think we need to be reminded that women's voices are even more underrepresented in economics than the headline figures suggest. So we hear a lot about the headline figures, that women are 15% of professors or 20% of central bankers, but, in terms of their opinions, that women's voices are going to be even less present than those headline figures suggest. So in terms of the expert economic panel, they're 21% of members, but only 14% of strong opinions, or 12% of comments. So you start from a minority, and in terms of comments and voices, women even less present. So any gender differences in expressing opinions are going to amplify substantive differences in opinions. So we knew before that men and women have different opinions. If men give those opinions more forcefully, and if people respond to them according to the forcefulness, then that's just going to amplify those gender differences in substantive opinions. And a recommendation to IGM is that they stop weighting by confidence and do not pay attention to the strength of opinions, because in doing so it gives more weight to the opinions of men. There may be a concern that economic opinions in more male fields are likely to express more confidently. So maybe macro opinions are expressed more confidently than labour opinions, so that would matter for policy. And something that I think we need to explore further with examples is increasing the share of women is likely to imply greater uncertainty and caution in economic opinions. So next slide, please. So this is where we sort of started to look at the Monetary Policy Committee to see if what we see in the economic expert panel also can be found in the opinions of a group of economists who are directly involved in policy making. So the Monetary Policy Committee sets the interest rate for the Bank of England. There are 9 members at any one time, 5 internal, 4 external. There's been 43 members since 97 when the Bank of England became independent. 260 votes, so those are economic opinions, and around 20% made by women. So there is going to be, there's a high level of consensus among Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee members, but I think unlike, my understanding is unlike the Open Market Committee, there's slightly greater variation in the votes. So we have 47% of votes with some dissent. So in other words, there is some variation, and the votes are seen as the opinions of the members. So Monetary Policy Committee members are encouraged to vote according to their own beliefs and express their own opinions. So we're aware there's a literature on the sort of preferences of women on central banks. They tend to behave more hawkishly. So we were trying to think of how differences in confidence might manifest in voting behaviour. Next slide, please. So our current indicators are sort of two measures of what we think of as cautiousness. One is voting for the status quo, and the other is voting against the consensus. So, our preliminary findings, which we think parallel the opinions expressed by the expert panel members, which show women are more cautious and less confident. Women on the Monetary Policy Committee are more likely to vote with the status quo and less likely to vote against the consensus. So this we see as being sort of tentative evidence that the differences in opinions that we see expressed by the IGM panel are also affecting behaviour in a real world policy making situation. Next slide, please. So just to sum up, and I think this is preliminary, I think the results are striking, and I think it's important to make this point. So I'll make it again, so gender differences in opinions, the way opinions are expressed means that women's voices are even more underrepresented than the headline figures. I think we should think about, what this means. It's easy to think that the conclusion of this is that women should assert themselves more. That's not what we're saying. It could well be that it's men who are overconfident and expressing their opinions too strongly. I think an important area to investigate further is, in a sense, who is listened to. So our prior is that people are listened to according to how strongly they express their opinions and how confidently they express their opinions. Of course, if people know that men are going to express opinions strongly and confidently, it may be that male voices are less influential relative to females expressed in the same way, but we don't have any evidence for that. So in the absence of evidence to show that men are listened to less when they express opinions confidently, the concern is that male voices expressed confidently and strong opinions are going to be heard more than women's. The key question is sort of who is right. I mean, sometimes these are just opinions. There isn't a right or a wrong. There is just an opinion. But so men will be more influential in policy making. I think if we think that if strength of opinion and confidence in opinion is what carries weight. And I think there is an issue. Possibly that men are too confident and too forceful in their opinions. So the evidence from other studies which have looked at male confidence and male opinions tends to suggest that it's the men who are overconfident, not the women who are underconfident. So relative to their actual performance, men tend to rate their ability too highly, for example, or male traders tend to have too much, they believe too much in the precision of their own beliefs, and they tend to trade too much. So evidence from other areas suggests that it's the men who are overconfident rather than women that are underconfident. So I like the quote from Danny Roderick saying it's okay to say that you don't know, and maybe economists don't say we don't know enough, or at least male economists don't say they don't know enough. I think there are some, implications for economic debate and decision-making, the nature of economic debate and decision-making. And I think there are also implications for the discipline itself. So I very much like this quote. Confidence is perhaps the greatest achievement of the economics profession. Economists' willingness to express opinions about complex matters confidently means that economists are influential, possibly. But obviously, it's likely to be a characteristic which has also given rise to criticism of economics. It's also, while it's our greatest achievement, it also may be its Achilles heel, and it may be a function of a very male-dominated profession, and a more diverse profession might express itself very differently, more cautiously, and perhaps with differences in the way it's perceived by other disciplines in the outside world. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We'll go straight to Amanda's discussion.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for having me and giving me this opportunity to comment on a really great paper. Next slide. So as you heard, this paper explores gender differences in expressed opinions using two different samples of economic experts, and finds significant gender differences that do not attenuate over time. Next slide. So I think this is a fabulous paper. It provides direct evidence on gender differences in economics and central banking in a way that we just didn't have access to 3 years ago when we started this conference series at the Bank of England. It presents a really rich analysis, as I'm sure you understood from Sarah's presentation, considering multiple measures of expression and the role of experience. It uses data on two different groups of economic experts, including one making policy decisions. It offers an extremely thoughtful discussion of causes and effects throughout the paper, something I really appreciate and that doesn't happen all the time within our field. And it has really important implications, as Sarah told us. Next slide, please. So we've been asked to comment not only on the technical aspects of the analyses, but also to connect to broader issues of diversity, inclusion, and equity in the profession and society. So I'll do that in my comments. Next slide, please. Thanks. But I want to start with two smaller technical issues. The first is the question, might controlling for citations and the regressions cause collider bias? And this is always an important question to ask, but especially when investigating disparities, in my opinion, and especially given the evidence that we saw in the first paper in this session, that there's a connection between gender and citations. The second technical or smaller issue is I would love for the authors to deal head on with the distinction between opinions and reports of those opinions in the paper, because we know the data can only tell us the reported opinions. And for instance, as Blinder notes, there may be reasons that the committee members would, for instance, go along in a stated way with the consensus, even though behind closed doors, the discussion could have been different. Next slide, please. So, first lesson for all of us, differences are not deficiencies. So within economic research and broader society, there's a bit of finger pointing, it seems, and possible bias in explaining gender differences. For instance, within economics, we've seen trends in research that women can't do math, women don't like money, women don't like risk, women don't negotiate, women don't say no, women don't lean in, women don't speak up. And those are important things to investigate, but they're framed in a certain way. And actually, over time, each of those attributes has been in some ways disproven or kind of shown to be inferior to other explanations. Next slide. So here's just one possible rephrasing of the empirical results in the paper. We could say men talk a lot, make conclusions more readily, stake out a position even when most other experts see the evidence differently and think they are right. And to me, that also accurately characterizes the empirical evidence. Next slide, please. So we see that it's really important to examine our implicit assumptions as we state and hear the results of economic research. And there could be a problem in how we phrase things or interpret results, or even how we set up our models. And as Bill Spriggs very importantly noted, in the overwhelming case of economic analysis, a model of racial differences assumes there is something deficient about Black people. And so there's a way in which we as economists hold a responsibility to think carefully about how we're setting things up and presenting them. Next slide, please. So as Sarah and her paper says, it's okay to say, I don't know sometimes. The world is complicated. Uncertain may exactly be the appropriate response. And a little analysis I did just to shed more light on the situation was I downloaded some of Chicago Booth's IGM data, only for the US panel and for questions in 2021. But I found that economists of both genders are more likely to comment when they record their position as uncertain. So that indicates that there's something more to explain about the situation. They see some complication that demands both perhaps an uncertain response and a comment. And so we just want to make sure that, that we don't state certainty when we don't have certainty, as Sarah concluded her presentation. And, there's this last point, monetary policy makers or policymakers in general might feel that it's best to communicate clearly and with a single voice and with a straight path forward, even if they understand the complications. And, you know, that's the same story or argument I hear from instructors of undergraduate economics, that reality is too complicated to explain to the students. So we better tell them a simple story. But in doing that, we tell them an inaccurate story. And to my mind, at least in the education, economics education realm, it's led to significant efficiency and equity problems. So of course, there are communication issues that policymakers have to consider, but it would be good to reconsider the conclusions. Lesson 3, next slide. So of course, we all need to listen carefully. And in the context of this paper, I went down and looked at the text of the comments that the experts offered through the IGM survey. And I think it would be fun for the authors to do some text analysis of those comments. And here I have shown you a non-random sample of comments, but let me just say, all of them are really thoughtful, and well, not all of them, many of them, men and women, are really thoughtful about what they say and how they respond. But we do see some comments that point to definitions or details or how the response would depend on conditions. And so looking for those keywords in a text analysis, or perhaps looking for some sentiment analysis about whether comments are sincere or sassy or nuanced or full of dogma or positive or negative. I think it would be pretty fun to see if there are any gender differences in those. But what I fear is that sound bites are amplified by, actors outside the economists themselves. So in the media, perhaps in the general public, perhaps by economics instructors. And if that's true, then the voice problem, the underrepresentation problem that Sarah really insightfully identifies, that women's voice is even less represented than headline figures suggest, would be even more of an issue if their comments, their insights aren't repeated by others. And indeed, if the comments and the insights are more nuanced or longer-winded, it may be for good reason, but they're not necessarily going to be heard. Next slide, please. Lesson 4, build inclusion. So, there are structures we can put in place in our organizations to make sure that all members are heard. So individuals with different propensities and types of expression can all contribute. One example is that the Federal Reserve research divisions have created and disseminated inclusive meeting guidelines to make sure that all of our small meetings are done in a way that every member can contribute. Another example is the issue of optimal monetary policy committee design. And I know that this has been examined in the literature, but not the inclusion aspect of it. So how does the structure of the conversation through voting protocols and numbers of meetings, the agendas of meetings, and procedures within those meetings affect the inclusiveness of the environment and the ability of all participants to speak and contribute? So that could be not only a research question moving forward, but of course, one that the monetary policy committees take head on in examining whether there are procedures they could add to their current structure that would generate even more inclusion. Next slide, please. The fifth and final lesson I'll share, be an effective bystander. So what I did is I went to this same smaller sample that I pulled of IGM data, the economic experts data, and I looked at the distributions. And what I find is that a minority of respondents, all of whom are men, produce the bulk of the comments. And so 5 individuals out of 43 for this sample are responsible for 30% of the comments. 10 individuals are responsible for half of the comments. Yet the median man comments just as frequently or infrequently as the median woman. So what we see is that, I'd say the vast majority, to build an analogy to the broader profession, are really well-meaning, well-behaved, right? And concerned potentially about all voices being heard. But all of us individually have the ability and responsibility to kind of help make conversation more productive. And so, within a spoken meeting, there are opportunities for individuals to tell other individuals, okay, all right, we've heard you, let's hear from this other person. And as far as policy structures that could remove the outlier number of comments, you could do what we do in classrooms all the time, that if there's a student who's speaking up very often, we could ration their airtime. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I'll just say this is a great paper that's going to teach us a lot, not only about the situations at hand, but some broader lessons. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. So before we go to questions, and I encourage people to raise their hands, Sarah, do you want to answer to Amanda's discussion?
No, I just want to say thank you so much for engaging so thoughtfully with the draft paper and providing really useful comments for both presenting the work so far and I think other things to look at. I was very careful at the end to say, I don't think that this implies that women should speak up, but I agree that the language throughout is presented as if it's, men are the benchmark and women sort of are judged relative to that benchmark. So I think it's a very fair point. We've thought about doing text analysis of the comments. I like your suggestions for how we should approach that. And then, other comments I will incorporate into the analysis. So just thank you very much for a very insightful discussion.
So I think that Julia went first, and then we'll go to Marlene.
Yeah, thanks so much. Really great paper. I mean, particularly given how often economists are actually wrong. So maybe, a more humble approach by men, given your findings, might not be a bad thing. I found your analysis of the MPC really interesting, and maybe one quick observation or one and a comment. So in terms of comment, I think that there are sort of 2 types of minority votes. So one could be a vote for change, but a minority vote, or you could vote for the status quo when the majority votes for change. And I'd be interested if there's a difference between men and women here. And then the other is sort of a bit provocative. I mean, if conclusion is that women tend to vote with a consensus, there's also a lot of discussion around groupthink in central banks and on committees in particular, and wanting to avoid that. So is there a danger with having more women on committees that we might end up with more groupthink? Thanks.
I think, I mean, to be honest, so I think the sort of monetary policy voting is not necessarily, it's not our area of expertise. And I think, these are very preliminary measures. I think we could do more. And I think also possibly examining how votes are relative to, say, market expectations. So what we wanted to capture is that women have greater uncertainty about their beliefs, I think. And so men are sort of, believing things much more confidently than women. I think we haven't necessarily reflected that fully in the measures that we've got, and can explore the sort of different possibilities more fully. So yeah. Yeah, I mean, and again, I mean, this group think, I mean, it really depends on what's right and what's wrong. I mean, I don't know, so is it, sometimes you want caution and sometimes you don't, I guess, so we'll need to think about whether caution is socially optimal. I think globally it is. I think economics would benefit from greater caution personally, but not necessarily every decision would be better off if it were a cautious one.
Marlene, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sarah, for the great paper. I have just two quick questions. I was wondering to which extent some research regarding some outcome like no comment or no response and so on could be just due to the fact that, I don't, maybe women do not think it's important, it's relevant, so, or they have other stuff to do, I don't know, family commitment. I mean, those have been proven that we have a difference in the between men and women in the literature regarding those outcomes. Like, to which extent it's not just a difference in terms of how we express our opinion, but just that, okay, you don't find it like really important, so you don't spend that much time on this and so on. And the second point is there a way to regarding the question of which answer is the right answer? Is it being just inserted in the right path, or having a strong view of the right path? Like, if you can see, especially for the Central Bank Committee, if what happened if comparing to the decision that, or the vote that have been done, and compared to what happened after. I understand that you may lack some counterfactual to make a proper analysis, but still it could be insightful to see like just what happened after, if it was the right path or the wrong path. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just with regard to your first thing, I mean, so do women think it's important or not? I mean, I think this is a group of people who've agreed to be part of a panel where they're going to be asked for their opinions. And I think we also see this gender difference when it comes to the field in which they're expert. So if it was just women give opinions only when it's in their field, and men give opinions all the time, I think that would sort of speak to the importance issue. But I think the fact that it's a very self-selected group of people who've agreed to give their opinions, so they obviously regard this as an important activity because they've agreed to sign up. And also when it comes to their sort of specific fields of interest, you also see this gender difference. I think that's suggesting that it's important. And that's also why why we wanted also to look at a real world situation as well, so that the consistency is sort of illustrating it is a meaningful difference. And yet, no, I agree that it matters not only that these differences are present, but also what does it mean for society, which is sort of your question about who's right, who's wrong, and we will do some more thinking about how we would measure that.
So next we have Neil and then Lisa. And in the meantime, can I also remind everyone who have already asked questions to put their hands down? Thank you.
Yes, Neil Erickson at the board. Can you hear me, Chiara? Yes, good. So my comment really builds on one of Amanda's slides about listening carefully, and in terms of possible additional and sort of complementary interpretation, namely that there may be gender differences when communicating the same message. And this may also apply in terms of racial differences or ethnic differences. And so Sarah's mention about the importance of adjusting those voices, and the recommendation not having IGM do weighting seems to be really important. And this is something that also, could very well comes up in other disciplines where there are experts expressing confidence. And one that obviously comes to mind is with doctors, not only in serving as an expert opinion, but also in terms of design of all sorts of medical experiments. And the well-known situation is, of course, in drug testing, which typically was done on young, white, healthy males, which is not representative of the general population. Then just actually a question or thought for Marlene. There actually may be larger biases than the 2020 that you were picking up due to sample selection with working with the top 20 journals. And that could happen either directly because of sample selection bias by editors at the journals, but also implicit bias by what sort of research topics are chosen by men versus by women. And it's something like a Heckman type bias for sample selection. And it is something that might be correctable in principle and maybe in fact.
Yeah, just say thank you. I think the doctor's example is a really very relevant one. I haven't looked to see whether anyone has studied the confidence of doctors, but I agree that that might well be comparable to the case of economic experts.
Lisa, do you want to go ahead? Tim, can you?
Having a little trouble moving her up to a panelist, but I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Lisa, if you want to go ahead and ask your question verbally.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Yeah, I don't know what was going on there. So I was thinking sort of about this issue of overconfidence that you mentioned kind of at the end of the presentation. So one thing this brought to mind is that there's this, I think, somewhat well-known relationship that if you ask someone to self-report their own knowledge of financial matters, and then you also have them take like an objective financial literacy test, you'll find some sort of odd patterns in the tails. And so you'll see there's sort of generally a positive correlation in that folks are somewhat more confident and when their literacy is higher, but that the people who report the very highest level of confidence tend to actually perform worse on the financial literacy exam than people that are a little bit less confident. And so I wondered if you had sort of done anything looking at like kind of the tails here and sort of seen if there were gender differences in being extremely confident, and then maybe especially being extremely confident in a field that's not your own, and whether, you know, that might give you just maybe a little bit more insight into how much of your sample might be sort of expressing overconfidence, and whether there's sort of gender differences on that margin.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we'll look more because we just looked at the means, but we can look more at the distribution.
So thank you. I think that this brings us to the end of this session. So let me conclude by thanking all the presenters, all the discussants for the great conversation.